Shalom Aleichem. Although the Sicha that we learn Acharei Gimel doesn't say that it's a siyum, originally it was put together as a siyum, at least parts of it. So let's look into the Farbrengens and see if we can learn a few things, nuggets from that Farbrengens that didn't make it into the Sicha. I believe there are quite a few interesting ideas. Rabbi spoke about that because the Seder is Yutas Kislev. Besides yard sites, that would make a siyum on Yutas Kislev because it was a Chalukas Hashas. So they'll make a siyum on Maseches Yoma, the idea of tshuva. Even though we already made a siyum on Maseches Yoma, nevertheless, we're going to do it again. Now, this is before the Sicha that we've learned in Acharei because this is in Tafshin Chaf Tes. And that the Sicha we learned Acharei is Tafshin Lamed Vav. Already then the Rebbe said, Siyom Iman Yoma. The Rebbe says this is interesting. One of the amazing things that the Ascholos of Geras HaTshuva, that Beinu Zakin starts in the end of Yoma, even though he says Tanya B'Seif Yom, even though this place says Daf Pei Vav, and there's still quite a few dapim before the end. Nevertheless, it's B'Seif Yoma. That's the idea. It's like part of the Siyum. And in general, like we do by a Siyum, we're going to say something in Nigla. And as we know that the qualifications, that Tzemach Tzedek writes, that Pnimius HaTorah has its own limits and standards of how to learn, and Nigla Torah has its own way of learning, and you don't mix the two. Even though there are things that you can learn a principle from one to the other, but the general, as the Rebbe says, musagim amunachim, the principles and the underlying foundations of thought are different in Nigla and in Chassidus. Etc. Now, obviously, Torah is one, but there'll be different nuances in Nigla and Chassidus. Then the Rebbe went on to explain the words of the Alter Rebbe, Tani B'Seif Yom, Shleisha Chalukei Kaparim, etc. And the fact that he doesn't bring the part of Chilul Hashem. And the pshat is that the Gimel Chalukei Kaparim are not mitzvahs leisei krisis meist in Chilul Hashem, like the Maharsha says, but rather mitzvahs say mitzvahs leisei krisis mitzvahs based in. Because even though even though kapara is not part of the tshuva, nevertheless it's the shleimus tshuva. So even though kapara itself has 4 different kind of kaparas, nevertheless kapara in regards to mitzvahs tshuva, they're only shleisha chalukei kapara. In other words, that things that you can do in life, but chilul Hashem is only la'achar misa. Now, some of the ideas that were explored over here was on the point that he says that kapara is not etzem hatshuva, that it's not etzem hatshuva. The etzem hatshuva is as if it's a chet, leaving the chet, and it's not so much about regret. The Rebbe says, like the Alter Rebbe writes in Geras HaTshuva, and he proves it from the din of psuli edus mitzad aveda. That somebody who cannot testify because of Avera, the only thing they have to do is do tshuva. For example, people who play cards, etc., or gamble, the moment they break their gambling items, then it's a proof that they left the chet, even if they didn't have charata. Then on the point that the Rebbe said that kapara, even though it's not part of tshuva, it's shleimus tshuva, therefore you have to bring a carbon as well. Not so that going forward you're Adam Kasher, which is the main part of tshuva, but more to atone for the past. Oh, v'nechmad v'nkarv, you did like the Rambam writes, you should be once again close to Hashem. Then on the idea that it says that mitzvahs, specifically neshama b'guf, the Rebbe went on to explain in general the idea of mitzvahs tshuva, the way it's complete is that after that you'll be obligated kiyum Torah mitzvahs the way you were before a chet and even more. So you show that the idea of tshuva is that you're still alive after. In other words, you could still do tshuva. That's the ultimate tshuva, not when there's nothing after. Like that, Rabbi Shmuel finishes himself by Yoma Yireh Zerah. He'll see descendants Yadacham will live a long life. In other words, that's the ultimate point of tshuva. And the Rebbe finished off the Sicha saying, even though Chil Hashem Osa has certain ways that you could atone in life. And one of the ways is by bringing tshuva to people that were influenced. The Rebbe says like this. First of all, on the idea that Chil Hashem in general is only neshama, and in Olam Haba, the Chazal say that you're dirty in this world, but not dirty in the Olam Haba, because neshama is pure. The neshama throws off the guf, and therefore you can have tshuva for Chil Hashem. But the idea of the Chil Hashem, you could even do some kind of tshuva. The Rebbe brings from what the Alter Rebbe writes in the Gersa Tshuva test, that the famous sin of Beis Eli. Beis Eli was the Kohen Gadol in the time of Shmuel Hanavi, when Shmuel was just a child, and his sons Chafni and Pinchas were doing a lot of averos, or whatever, different explanations what exactly the sin was. But the point is, the Mishkan became a place of corruption, and the sin, the consequences, even in their lifetime, were dire. Eli died, his brothers died, his daughter-in-law miscarried, his daughter-in-law died, etc. It was a terrible tragedy, as you read in the beginning of the Sefer Shmuel Aleph. But it says over there that the sin of Beis Eli, B'zevach Mincha, is not atoned through Karbanis, but it is atoned through Teiling Mosadim. In other words, you could do something. And Oven Beis Eli was specifically a Chil Hashem, like the Navi said to Eli regarding his children's sin. I'll honor those who honor me, but those who disgrace me will be cursed. In other words, they were disgracing Hashem. And nevertheless, there could be atonement. So that's where you see there could be atonement. And then on the idea of bringing tshuva, the people that were influenced, the Rebbe said, you see that sometimes in the Gemara and the Eidovin, etc., the Amora comes and says, in other words, you have to fix what you've done. So Bavarn, to make sure that there will not be any damage after that. Then the Rebbe went on to the Sicha to talk about the idea of similarities between Shuvah and Torah and Tefillah. But let's move on to the next Farbrengen. The next Farbrengen, the Rebbe goes and says like this. This was a Farbrengen of Shabbos Parshas Vayeshev. And the Rebbe introduced and said like this. We know, let me start over here, the idea of what the Yiddish Kislev is, and the Mile of Chassidus Chabad, and specifically from stories. The stories used to be the room of Chassidus, but the truth is they're part of Torah Chassidus, as you see how much effort the Frierdiker Rebbe made to spread out stories, which means it's not just a room, but it's a part of learning Chassidus itself. And you see this even in Nigla, that you learn things, even Sichas Tamid Chachamim, Sicha Limud, you can learn things from the conversations of Tamid Chacham. And based on this, the Rebbe says we know the story about the dream of the Mittel Rebbe and the interpretation of the dream, about the different, the Baal Shem Tov and the Magid, and one's walking strong and one's not, and on the river, and some are able to stand on the ridge and some aren't, etc. And then specifically the Alter Rebbe was able to walk across, and everything was okay, and that was specifically because he helped Yidden bring tshuva. And the Alter Rebbe said that when I heard from the Magid, the Maimer, G'dayla Tshuva, and over there it explains about the mashal, about tzaddikim and Baal Tshuva, and based on two sons of the king, one that was close to the king and the king's happy, and the other one that didn't behave and was distant both physically and spiritually. So when the second son comes back, it creates an incredible simcha and tainig, more than when the first kid who never left. So I accepted upon myself then to make Baal Tshuva. So what do you see from here? That the chiddush of the Alter Rebbe and Torah Chassidus Chabad is making Bali Tshuva. Unlike the way people think that the Baal Tshuva is the idea of the Rebbe or the Frierdiker Rebbe, the whole Chabad is based on that. Another point, we know that everything has to be done b'simcha, simcha shal mitzvah. So too, Tshuva has to be done b'simcha. And it's an additional part. In other words, it's not a part of the mitzvah itself, but rather it's an addition. But that's only in Tshuva Tato, in the lower level of Tshuva. But the higher level of Tshuva, the simcha is part of the Tshuva, because in the lower level of Tshuva there's a bit of bitterness, etc. But in Tshuva Ilah is l'chatchila b'simcha rabba. And in regards to what we're saying, because by the Alter Rebbe everything was based on Avos Yisrael, so it's self-understood that when the Alter Rebbe was dealing with Baal Tshuva, obviously he didn't only want them to do Tshuva Tata, that they'll just be Sermei Avasi Tov, because that's not a chiddush of the Torah Samagid. It says clearly in the Torah, you have to bring people back. But rather, he wanted to accomplish Tshuva Ilah, like the expression of the Mitzvah Rebbe, that he blessed himself that when two younger light meet, they should talk about Yechuda Ilah, and in Tshuva that means Tshuva Ilah. So you see that that part of the chiddush, the Alter Rebbe, making Baal Tshuva, specifically Tshuva Ilah, and over there, that's an inyan of Simcha. And based on that, the Rebbe continued talking about what he spoke about, the idea of in the siyum that we just learned regarding the tshuva. And then again, the Rebbe continued talking about Torah, Tefillah, tshuva, and each one of them and how they manifest. L'chaim.